Hello, aviators. Welcome back to the Finer Points. In this episode, we are going to talk about the potential myth of the 70-50 rule. This is a rule that I have been teaching for decades. It's a rule that many other pilots teach. I guess more specifically, it's a rule of thumb, but it says that if you have 70% of your takeoff speed by the halfway point, then you can continue with the takeoff. Or more accurately, as we'll learn at the end of this podcast, if you do not have 70% of your takeoff speed by the halfway point, it's time to abort. I'm Jason Miller, and you're listening to the Finer Points. This podcast is brought to you in part by the patrons of the Finer Points. Not only support this show and allow us to get quality flight training out to the internet, but they also get bonus content, including weekly office hours sessions with me, which are quite interesting. We often have DPEs and various other industry people pop in there. That is at 12 p.m. Pacific every Friday, and we do have archives that we post to Patreon. So if you're interested in doing a benevolent thing and helping us get quality flight training internet content out to the internet, or getting bonus content, or joining us on office hours, please visit patreon.com/learntfp. It's also brought to you in part by the Ground School app. This is the essential app for new and experienced pilots. There are 4 courses in this app, from standard operating procedures to mastering landings to a complete private pilot course, which is great. If you have a flight review coming up, there are mock orals in there. Also an instrument course if you're looking at polishing your instrument skills. You can get a free 3-day trial of the Ground School app also at learnthefinerpoints.com. Please consider becoming a patron and supporting this show, and also getting your free 3-day trial of the Ground School app. I don't know if you guys are watching this video or if you're listening to this as a podcast, but I do want to let you know that the format, I'm experimenting a little bit here with the format because I would like to publish these podcasts to the internet, and I'm not going to do that on our regular YouTube channel for algorithmic reasons. But we do have a separate YouTube channel called TFP Clips, and these podcasts are published there in a video form. And then also, of course, anywhere you listen to podcasts as an audio podcast. So if you hear me reference something that I might be looking at or showing, just know you can find that at the TFP Clips channel on YouTube. Also, of course, on Patreon. And if you're listening, you can listen anywhere you get podcasts. So I want to tell you guys that a lot of people have been asking me lately if I had heard the Cavagnaro interview on the Max Trescott podcast, Aviation News Talk. Now, I know this published about a year ago, but it was very fascinating. And I have a lot of respect for both of those pilots, Catherine and Max. So if you haven't heard Max's great podcast, definitely check it out. It is Aviation News Talk. And Catherine is not only a pilot and aerobatic instructor, but she's also a mathematician, right? And she was the first person that I'd ever heard really, have a bone to pick with the 70-50 rule, which is a rule of thumb. It came for me first out of the Mountain Flying Handbook or the Mountain Flying Bible, rather, written by Sparky Imeson. And I just kind of took it on faith, I suppose, as many of the rest of us in the industry did. And I have been teaching that rule that says if you don't have 70% of your takeoff speed by the halfway point, it's time to abort the takeoff. That's part of my pre-takeoff briefing every time I fly, even selecting the abort point. It's part of what I teach students. And after listening to that podcast, I was asking myself, gosh, am I teaching the right thing? Is Catherine correct in saying that this is simply a myth, that there's really no math behind this at all, and there's a much better way to approach this? Now, I'm not going to spoil the whole podcast there, but I will boil it down for you and tell you that what Catherine ultimately comes up with is that if we are in a critical takeoff situation, or perhaps for any takeoff situation, we should be using takeoff performance charts, which factor in things like density, altitude, right? Because it takes in your pressure altitude corrected for temperature. It's got notes about the surface conditions. It's got notes about slope or tailwind, right? All of this stuff is sort of factored into the performance takeoff chart. And so what she's saying is you should really just figure out what your ground roll should be, buffer that. She says by 20%, but I would say on a really critical takeoff by as much as 50%. Anyway, you buffer that, and then find a point on the runway that equals that number. And if your wheels are not off by that point, then you're not going to make this. This is not going to be a successful takeoff. Or maybe more appropriately in her case, if your wheels are off by that point, then it will be a successful takeoff. And then just to make sure that you have enough distance in front of you to stop in the event that you abort, you should look at the landing tables, calculate the ground roll and say, okay, from that point, based on those ground roll numbers, do I have enough distance to stop if I decide to, abort this takeoff? And that is great. So that is certainly something that we should consider changing to if it's a critical takeoff. But I spent a lot of time thinking about that 70-50 rule, and I thought, I'm not really enough of a math guy to know if this makes any sense or not, what Catherine's saying about the math. So I called up my friend Matt Guthmiller, who is a math guy, and he's a former MIT graduate. He's also the founder of the 8-Flight app, and decided to talk to him about it. Like, what is the math behind the 70-50 rule? And, is what Catherine's saying, does that make a lot of sense? And how should we sort of think about this? So I thought you guys would enjoy that conversation. We can distill it down to the takeaways at the end of this, but I just want to play the complete conversation that I had with Matt Guthmiller from the 8-Flight app here for you to listen to. So check it out. But cool, man. It's nice to see you again. Thanks for agreeing to join me here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's I've been, I saw this podcast with Max Trescott and Catherine Cavagnaro, and I want to shout them out too, because it was a great conversation, and Catherine brought up some great points and just got me thinking about something that I have been teaching basically my whole career, and wondering if I'm just spreading tribal knowledge, and to just kind of summarize, I know you looked at the podcast, but just to kind of summarize it, it's the 70-50 rule, where I always tell my students, we pick an abort point on the runway, typically the halfway point of the runway. But I even saying that, it's like I realize there's slop in that right away, because when I'm out going off of a 5,000 foot runway, I think I pick like the first taxiway. I just pick some arbitrary point, and I say, if we don't have 70% of our rotation speed by that point, we're going to abort the takeoff. And for the sake of discussion, let's just call it the halfway point, because there have been times in my career where I've taken that very seriously and been at, mountain airports. And I remember at least one case walking the runway to count the stripes so that I could mark the midpoint of the runway, And I think I got it from the mountain flying Bible, Sparky Imeson, who later died in a mountain flying accident. So there's that, I don't know what that means exactly, but there you go. And, and that's what I teach, and I think for me, as like listening to, so Catherine sort of kind of broke it down and kind of called it ludicrous. She said, look, acceleration is not linear. It's not taking into account the drag of the air. It's not taking into account if there's a slope on the runway or if there's a headwind or like all of these things. And she suggested maybe it's better to actually use book data and, let's use the takeoff performance chart, which bakes in the atmospheric conditions, the temperature, the pressure, altitude. We'll figure out how long the ground roll will be, and we'll mark that point. And if we're not off the ground by that point plus 20%, let's say, then it's black and white. You're either off the ground by that point that they said you'd be off the ground, or you're not. And you buffer that for safety a little bit. And there was some more to it. And I thought, initially, okay, that's great. I don't know what I've been teaching, and I think still it's probably a good idea to base it on takeoff performance charts. That's what the airlines do, and that seems fine. But the thing that's been troubling me is the 70-50 rule as bad as she said it was? You know what I mean? It's like, okay, so I'll swallow the pill that we should probably go off takeoff performance charts, and no gripe there. But I was starting to think it's like, it's more math than my brain can handle. But if there is a slope on the runway, isn't that sort of baked into the equation? Like, you either have 70% of your speed or not. I mean, you're accelerating the way the airplane normally accelerates. And so anyway, I just wanted to reach out to you, who understands math a lot better than I do, to help me kind of get my head around, is the 70-50 rule as bunk as she says it is?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things. One, it's important to kind of understand where it comes from. And I'll kind of get to that in a second. But it's also just like, there's a couple very specific things that it's good for. And it's not a replacement for, the book performance numbers, but it's kind of like this, like any rule of thumb, right? It's this rough check on everything else. And so, it's just kind of this extra little safety thing to have in. And to some extent, it might even be a holdover from the days when, POHs were this thick and you didn't have super detailed takeoff performance data and stuff like that. So, I guess, first is like, where does it come from? And for that, we kind of have to go to like basic physics. So there's these few different concepts that are related, like, right? We know distance is, how far you go. We know that velocity is like distance per time, right? It's how far you go in a given period of time, 60 nautical miles per hour or something, right? And then there's this next level down, which is acceleration. And that's the part that I think people sometimes overlook a little bit. Acceleration is just the rate at which the velocity changes. And there's a number of ways that like this is really kind of useful to think about in aviation, because there's so many things where like, we need to change velocity, and like, what does that actually mean? What do we have to do? And sometimes people are like, oh, I need to slow down. I'm going to pull the power out. And now they're like, oh, shoot, I'm too slow. I got to put some power back in. Like, what's going on there? And so first of all, like, I think just like a little deep dive in acceleration, partly just because it's fun. But it's like
fun for you, maybe.
Right. Well, it's like you go to like Newton's laws of motion, right? Like an object in motion stays in motion, object at rest stays at rest. Like a force is mass times acceleration. So we talk a lot about like straight and level flight, unaccelerated flight being where all the forces are equal. So you're not speeding up, you're not slowing down. One thing to kind of get out of the way too, acceleration can either be positive or negative, right? So like sometimes you hear like deceleration, and usually people are talking about braking, but it's kind of ambiguous because it's like, well, is the magnitude of the acceleration getting smaller, or are we going in the opposite direction? So I'm just going to talk about acceleration, period. So, there's a lot of times where, and like this comes up a lot in formation flying, for example, where like you're like a little far back from, the airplane you're flying off of, and you need to, move up. And one of the things that's thrown out is for any change that you make, like immediately take half of it out. So if you add some power, immediately take half of it out, because the problem is you don't actually want to change your velocity. You need to change your velocity. You need to accelerate forward, move in, and now you need to accelerate in the opposite direction to zero out that relative velocity to stay there. The same thing's true when you're on approach and you're a little faster, a little slow. You need to take some power out, slow down. That change in power means that now those forces are unbalanced. So you're going to have some constant acceleration. That velocity is going to change at a constant rate. And now if you want to stop that, you got to put the power back in so that those forces are equal. It'll initially, so the forces are unbalanced, you kind of accelerate the other way. Forces are equal so that, you get that zero velocity. So it's a little bit off topic, but like basically what I'm getting at here is, we've got distance, we've got velocity, and we've got acceleration. So just the tiniest bit of I guess to go the other way, we know that, distance is velocity times time, right? So velocity is also acceleration times time. So if we need to accelerate to say 70 knots to take off, if we assume for a minute, and we'll get into this too, but like if we assume that acceleration is constant, then given that we are going to accelerate at whatever rate, we need some period of time to get to that velocity. And that acceleration rate is going to depend on density, altitude, how much power we have, how heavy we are, the slope of the runway, all these different things, right? But if it's constant, it's going to take some amount of time. Now, so that's how we get from like acceleration to velocity. So then the question is, how do we get from acceleration to distance? And for that, we need just like the tiniest bit of calculus, which is just a way of saying like this is not a made up equation, but like essentially instead of just acceleration times time, now we get 1/2 acceleration times squared. So that's going to be the distance that it takes to accelerate to some velocity, given that it takes, time t to accelerate there, t squared is going to be proportional to that distance. So what that means.
Okay, because you lost me with that. I just want you to know.
The delivery is right here, I promise.
Okay.
So what that means is that the distance we're going to cover in that time that we're accelerating is going to be proportional to the time squared.
Okay.
So now, if we say, how much do we need to, how much distance are we going to cover if we say accelerate to 70% of our takeoff speed? That's going to be proportional to 0.7 squared. That's how we end up at, so that's 0.49. 50, you call it the 70-49 rule or the 50-71 rule, something like that, right? But that's how we get to this 50 number. And so that's kind of like how the math works there. Basically, like we know because this is going to be, we're accelerating at a constant rate, that's going to take time squared, or that, it's going to cover distance that's proportional to time squared. If we accelerate to, 0.7 t, which is going to be, 0.7 of our velocity, because velocity is acceleration times time. Mm-hmm. Now that distance is going to be proportional to 0.7 squared. So basically, that's why to accelerate to 70%, take 70% of the time, we're going to cover 50% of the distance.
I see. That's really fascinating. And so well, one thing that's fascinating about it is it's not based on nothing. So it's based on math. But that's probably also why the FAA, then I'm trying to think of how the FAA says it, because they don't say 70%. What is it? The FAA says it's slightly different. 70% of the distance required, I think, is what they say.
Yeah.
Is that right? So, instead of the speed, I can't. There's two versions of it. But I guess like one question is, and my brain was wrestling with this, and slope of the runway is that I know that acceleration is not linear, right? Or constant, right? The airplane's not going to accelerate the same way as it goes faster and faster and faster. But isn't that sort of baked into the equation in the sense that, like, if there is a slope on the runway and I got to a certain speed by the halfway point, can't I then assume, even if it's not linear, that that it's all gonna work out the rest of the way because I got, unless the slope changes. Like I can see if the slope changed.
And that's the thing. So this is all, again, this is just like the baseline. How do we get from, constant acceleration to velocity to distance? So this assumes that acceleration is constant, which it's not quite. If you just think about a takeoff rule, you hold the brakes, you put the power in, you let the brakes off, you feel that acceleration right away, right? You feel that force and you accelerate probably to 20 knots pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But it takes a minute to get to, the other 50 knots or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. The thing about that is, ultimately here, like by the time, because you're looking at this, 50% of the distance, 70% of the speed thing, like you're 70% of the way there. You've spent most of your time accelerating at a pretty constant rate. Like essentially it's going to be pretty quick, fast acceleration right away. And then it's going to kind of come down, and it's basically going to be more or less constant. Particularly, and some of this gets into technique. So like, if you're in a big airplane, you're in a jet, like they're designed, the AOA is going to be basically zero until you lift the nose and you rotate. And now the wing's producing lifts, you have induced drag. Mm-hmm. In, airplanes that most of us fly, there's a number of different ways that they're designed. And sometimes, you're rolling down the runway, you feel the nose getting light. That's in part because the wing is producing some lift. And so the more you can kind of zero that, that's, mostly it's at the elevator is. And so it depends how you trim the airplane. It depends on, and some of this is if you're in a backcountry strip, you're kind of blending this short field, soft field technique. So maybe you're a little lighter on the nose. So, the angle of attack isn't zero. You're creating induced drag. So, that's going to decrease that acceleration as you go along too.
Yeah.
But like at a high level, you can kind of assume that it's constant. But this gets to the other half of this equation. So we figured out like, why is it 70%? Why does it take, 50% of the distance to get to 70% of the speed, and it's, 0.7 squared. But why 0.7? And really, I think the reason for that is that it works out to half of the distance. So you kind of take it the other way around, because like basically any airplane, short of something with a ton of reverse, but like if you just look at the book numbers with, just braking, it's always much easier to land and stop in some distance than it is to take off in that distance.
Sure.
Because we need a bunch of power to accelerate, whatever, you step on the brakes, you're slowing down right away, right?
Yeah.
So if we've taken half of this distance to accelerate to some speed, now to accelerate in the negative direction to zero that speed is going to take that same amount of distance. But we can brake better than we can, accelerate with the engine. And so basically, like really what this gets at is at the 50% point, you should essentially, barring something extraordinary, always be able to stop in the remaining distance, because you've gotten to that speed in that distance. You should be able to get back to zero from that speed in that distance. And so
Sure.
that's why I think this is really like an actual, it's the most useful for that kind of thing. So you can use it as this sort of sanity check at halfway down the runway, because that's the point where you can stop. Beyond that, now it's getting a lot more complicated. You'd have to do some really hard math and like computer simulations to figure out how long that's going to take, right?
Yeah.
But it's like up at that point, you just used half, you got half left, you can stop. And so if at that point you're not at that 0.7, you're definitely not going to make it. If you're halfway down the runway and you glance down and you're looking at this and you're like, I think I'm going to make this, and you look down at the airspeed and you're not at least 70% of your speed, you're not going to make it. Like, just full stop. Like,
so it works in the inverted. Yeah, just pull it inside out and it works great. Yeah.
Right. And because again, like if anything, your acceleration is going to slow as you progress.
Sure.
So if you're not at least 70% at that point, it's not going to get any better from there. It's only going to get worse.
Right.
And so that's where it's like, again, it's not a replacement for the actual takeoff distance, because even if you are at 0.7 of your, rotation speed at 50% of the runway, you're actually probably not going to make it, because your acceleration is going to slow a bit from there. Like, it's pretty close, but like really you need a little bit of a cushion on there. And so that's where it's just this hard, fast. If you're not there and you've got 50% of the runway left, stop, because you're not going to, there's no chance.
Yeah. That's interesting.
A really strong headwind all of a sudden or something, I guess. But it's going to take a miracle.
Yeah. No, that's a great way to think about it. And I realize for me, I think for me as a flight instructor, the big win is just making sure people have some awareness of it. Like the reality is I'm not really taking off from strips where it really matters. I'm at Oakland or San Carlos, or like it's very, but there was a guy on my office hours call that I do every Friday who flies in Alaska. And he's like, to me, it matters, like I've been using this thing and I need to know the truth here.
Right. And so that's where it's like, it's important to know what it's actually useful for. And so that's where there's like two things. Like, one, if you're at 50% and you don't have 70% of your speed, stop, because you're not going to make it. So it's this good, like absolutely abort sort of thing. And again, it's not going to catch everything. It is, if you're even a couple knots over that, like, depending on circumstances, you still might not make it. But it's like, at that point, full stop, like, stop on the runway. It's not happening.
That's really great, actually. And well, just real quick, because like I realize the way you just explained that is the way I say it. Like that's how we say it. If I don't have 70% of my rotation speed at the halfway point, we're going to abort. I mean, it's really it's not that we say if we have 70% of the speed at the 50%, we're going to go. It's a go. It's more the other way. So it's interesting. Yeah.
Right. And so like from the flip side, if you take, say, the calculated takeoff distance, and you think, half of that, and at that point down the runway, you do this cross check of, are you at 70% of your speed? Again, basically you should be above it, but it's going to be pretty close. And, if there's some gusts or something, you're not probably going to be able to tell the difference. And so that's where it's like, it's just this good sanity check on like, is your engine good? Is your technique good? Is the slope, as expected? Like, are all of these things sort of as calculated? Did you make a mistake? Did you just do the math wrong? Maybe you thought it was going to take 1,300 feet to take off, and you're like, shoot, it's going to be 3,000 feet to take off. You went wrong on the chart somewhere, right? So like, it's this good sanity check of like, does this more or less make sense? Yeah. But I think in general, like, you probably shouldn't be taking off of a runway that's exactly the length that you've calculated you need to take off, right? Like, we just don't do that.
Sure.
And so like, that's where like, it's not like this tool that's like, oh yeah, I can make this. It's more of like, is this making sense? Does this acceleration match sort of what I expect it to be doing? Yeah. And then by the time I'm 50% down the runway, this is absolutely not working or something, So it's like these two ways to look at it, On the one, definitely abort. On the other one, just, does this make sense given, the calculated takeoff distance and halfway through that?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for clarifying that. And I think, for you and Catherine, really, because I think it's like, after listening to that podcast you did with Max, it's like, okay, if it really matters, like to the guy in Alaska, you need to pull out the performance charts and you need to do what Catherine's recommending. It's like, what's your ground roll, buffer it a little bit and figure out what your landing roll is to make sure you can stop if you don't make it, right? Right. But what you're saying is really like, I think what we've done is take this rule that you just clearly explained is really just a way of saying, if you don't have this, you're definitely not going to make it. So stop.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And making sure that people don't interpret that as a fine way to determine that you can go. Like what
Right.
I was doing, like that story I said up front when I was this is like way back when I first started mountain flying, where I counted the runway stripes and marked the halfway point. That was the wrong way to use this.
Mhm.
Right. That was where I was like, I was taking off of, it was a critical takeoff and I was concerned about it, but it doesn't guarantee you can go. It just tells you for sure you can't if you don't have it, you know.
Right. And maybe gives you a rough idea of, are you going to meet the performance that you thought you had or something like that. And, and there's a
Right.
few ways you could even drill down into that. If you have a headwind now, maybe if you have a 20 knot headwind, you don't have to accelerate to, by 70 knots, you have to accelerate by 50 knots or something now. And so really like that number you're looking for is 50, 0.7 of that, 35 knots. And now and add back in that 20. So you need, 55 knots at that halfway point instead of like 50 knots or something.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And similarly, you could kind of add a buffer like that. If you add, some number of knots above that, that's going to sort of be this constant, regardless of what the acceleration is, you're always going to be adding the same amount of buffer there because again, velocity is acceleration times time. So even if the acceleration is different now to get to like say 55 knots instead of 50 knots, you need the same amount of, proportional amount of time and distance. And so, you can do some things like that to kind of add a safety margin to that check. But again, it just kind of boils down to you're absolutely not going to make it, or, does this roughly kind of match what I expect?
Yeah. Cool. That's great. I did have one student who, he heard this and he just kind of stands out in my brain. And he was like, I don't know about that. Like he just kind of intuitively was like, I think he knew more about math than I did, and he was like, I don't know, this whole 70-50 thing. So his little solution was, he's like, can we at least use VX? He's like, can we at least say 70% of VX or something? And so I just want to clarify that is adding some additional safety buffer, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's the other part of it, and in that other podcast, they mentioned and I maybe I just never really paid any attention to it, but I guess what do they call it? The 70-30 rule, something like that. Yeah. For like, if you're clearing an obstacle, which, usually when we talk about obstacles in takeoff or landing, we mean a 50-foot obstacle because that's, what the book numbers are and stuff. And the only thing I could think of there, and that one to me, I guess what I'm getting at is here, that one, I'm like, that one doesn't really make sense. But I think what it is like, in most airplanes, it's kind of like close to about twice the takeoff rule to clear a 50-foot obstacle. Okay. And so if you just sort of assume that that's true, which it's not in every case, but it's kind of like, somewhat true, then, instead of like, the 50% point being halfway down the runway, now it's it's a quarter of the way down the runway,
right?
Or 30% because maybe it's not quite, 2 and 2, but like that's kind of where that comes from. But I don't think that one really applies. Like, again, it's like, are you accelerating the way you expect to? And you need to have some margin on whatever you're trying to do anyway.
Yeah, that's great. And so it's nice to know also that these two things are not mutually exclusive. It's right. Like you can plan via the book numbers and you can still keep this in your back pocket as a sort of dummy check when you get to the halfway mark,
Right. Because again, it's just this, it just comes from these basic physics equations. It's just like constant acceleration. What does that give us for distance? And so, for distance and velocity. And so that's just where all of that comes from. So you can use it either way. You could use it however you want. You could use it as a, some check of, go out and see where you're at different points, at 20 knots, at 40 knots, at 60 knots. And now kind of what the actual acceleration rate might be or how it differs in different parts. I mean, there's a lot you could do with this because it's just a ruler, right? Like it's just this in some amount of time, how much you're going to accelerate and how much, distance are you going to cover. But it boils down to just use that ruler however you want. And one way is 50% of the way down the runway, stop if you don't have 70% of the airspeed. And again, really 70% of the, change in velocity that you need. So if there's a headwind, you might need more.
Right.
And on the other side, compared to what you expect to need, this is just a point, halfway through that takeoff roll that you can kind of check, am I meeting at least that?
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Matt. Appreciate that. How are things going these days, by the way? How's the 8 flight app coming along? That's what you're working on mostly?
That's what I do, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. So
Wow.
that's why I have so
Wow.
many Chrome windows open right now. My computer's like, crazy slow. But no, it's been good just trying to, make it easier to go plan a flight, put all the weather information you need in one spot. And we just added FAA weather cameras, which are also kind of
Nice.
this thing where I'm like, most people, like, I feel like a lot of pilots just don't even know they exist, much
Yeah.
less like actually integrate them. And so we just put it right with METARs and things. So if there's not a METAR somewhere, you see the camera, and we use AI to figure out, like, is it VFR? Is it like IFR? What's going on there? So
Hmm.
before you even tap on it, you kind of know roughly at a glance what's happening, and that sort of thing.
I don't think I knew about it. Are these cameras that the FAA maintains? These are
They
like
are, yeah,
FAA?
yeah, yeah. So they're this fantastic resource. Like,
Huh.
forget 8 flight for a second. We make it the
Yeah.
easiest to like get to them. But there's this great FAA weather resource that are cameras, and it kind of started up in Alaska, where you
Hmm.
don't have a lot of weather reporting. You got all kinds of mountains and mountain passes, and you need to know, like, are the clouds above a point on the mountain where I can get through this pass, and those types of things. Like, what are those conditions like? And really up there, I mean, historically, it's kind of largely been, you talk to the flight service station, and they'll
Hmm.
look at the cameras and include that in your weather briefing.
Hmm.
But over the last, I don't know, 10, 20 years, they've expanded it to a lot of parts of the US as well. And there's some other groups that have their own, especially like backcountry strips and stuff, so you can kind of go see what conditions are like.
Yep.
So just across the board, like, weather cameras are great, but the problem has always been you have to go to this FAA website that's a little clunky and go figure out if there's a camera there or what it's showing, and click on all of them to see what they're doing. And
Hmm.
so we just put it all in one spot with the METARs. So if there's not a METAR there now, or the camera's a lot different than the METAR next to it or something like that, you can see, one, have a rough idea of what you're going to see on all these cameras without going to every single one. And they're just right there. Tap it, you can see the current image and see what the weather's doing, even when there's not a METAR there, or when the METAR doesn't really capture
Hmm.
what's happening, because there's a METAR, there's a weather station here, and there's a mountain there and a mountain there, and a valley here, and they're
Oh yeah.
all a little bit different.
Oh yeah. You're talking that flying in the Bay Area, like half the airport can be IFR literally, and
Right.
if the ASOS or AWOS is in the clear side of the airport, it'll report severe clear.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty excited about. But like the cameras have been on our like to do list for quite a while, and I just like
Mhm.
finally got to them, and finally like built out these computer vision models, so that, because that was the other thing. And like if you look at the cameras, you're like, okay, I got to tap on all of these to see if there's anything interesting. And at
Mhm.
least this way you get a pretty good idea. Like, is this camera particularly relevant right now, or that sort of thing.
Mhm.
And so I'm just like, I'm jazzed about that. Like, we do all these other things, forget about those. I'm like, weather cameras, that's where it's at.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. You got to stay inspired, right? You got to keep inspiring yourself. And
Right. Well, that's how this started. I was just like, I want the EFB that I want. I don't want to jump between a bunch of apps, call a bunch of FBOs. Just want all this
right.
information, one
Yeah.
spot. Just go do it.
Yeah, well, I think your timing is good. I was telling you at Oshkosh, I think that there's a appetite out there for just something simple, like relatively simple. I mean, I know it's a powerful tool, like these tablets and all of it, but it can get so cluttered that it's like, where's the just basic information that I want?
Right, exactly.
So,
Or you got to go to like 5 different layers to see, okay, like cloud cover, ceiling, which might not, capture few or scattered at some low level, and all the, like, there's all these different things where you just
yeah,
have all this information. And if you can just make it simpler to go look at it at a glance, and then to help plan a flight, with sort of better routings and, better information about FBOs and where you're going or where you can go stop right now, all these things, just make it simpler, make it easier. Even like VFR sectionals. Like, I love
yeah.
the sectional chart just across the board.
Thank you. I do too. I do
Like,
too. Like,
I'm a little bit of a cartography nerd. Like, I've got a whole stack of like sectionals from like the 40s and 50s and 60s, and like just some
wow.
fun little like
Yeah.
historical maps and stuff. But one of the most interesting things about them, they've basically not changed. Like, all the symbology is essentially the same. Like, there's a
Yeah.
reason they've been doing that for close to 100 years at this point. And it's
Yeah.
because it distills so much information about the terrain and where you're
Oh,
going, all in
everything. I
one spot.
mean, yeah, 100%. And the thing that bothers me about like data-driven charts, I guess is the right word, or is that half the stuff can be turned off and you won't even know it. Right.
Right.
So it's like the sectional, nothing's hiding anywhere. You can interpret so much information, like you said, at a glance. And I can't tell you how many times I picked up my iPad and I'm like, why is it? Oh, right. I have to turn on all the layers that I want to see. But if you forget to do that, you could miss like special use airspace or like, who knows what, you know?
Right. Yeah. Or some air, you're looking like, oh, there's no air mets anywhere. Like, let's go fly. Don't even need to look at the forecast, and you realize, oh shoot, there's icing, turbulence, whatever.
Sure.
You just didn't have it turned on. Like, things like that. But
Exactly.
but and on the sectional there, it's just like there's so much packaged so nicely, and that was one of the things for me too. Is like a lot of these other EFBs, because they've kind of focused so much on the data-driven charts. It's like you got to zoom into like the airport and nothing else to be able to like read something on the chart, or see how high is this mountain peak or something. And it's like, if you just had it, like if you had a piece of paper, you could just have the whole thing right here and you just glance at it and you have all that information, all the context around it. And so that's one of the other things we did, is just like super high resolution maps so that you can be zoomed out a reasonable way. And even on your iPhone, like still see everything around there and be able to read it and that kind of thing. So
100%. I couldn't agree with you more. I was going to start like a hashtag save the sectional campaign at one point, just because it's like, I think it's really important. And the FAA sometimes makes foolish decisions, foolish would seem like rash decisions, pulling things out. So hopefully, I don't know who.
Sorry, I was going to say they're talking about, basically getting rid of flight service station remote comm outlets.
I know.
And I'm like, they're like, oh, the volume has decreased like 99%. I'm like, cool, that's great. It's awesome that we have, tools like 8flight that make this stuff super simple. File a flight plan, activate it, close it, whatever, all these things, right? Yeah. But there are times where you don't have cell service. There's going to be like, I think now, like one of the things I'm also really excited about is everybody getting Starlink, and you just have such better live information in the cockpit. But there's always going to be somebody flying out in a Cub somewhere that's like a critical part of aviation on so many levels that's not going to have Starlink, that, is going to be outside of like ADS-B coverage even or something. But they might be able to call somebody on the radio given, that coverage today.
Yeah. And I mean, gosh, we were talking about this on my last call because, I do those airplane camp trips where we go out to pretty like relatively remote locations for folks. This year we're doing 4. We're going to like Idaho, Baja, Monument Valley, mountains of California. And one of the things that I kind of make everybody do out there on any of those trips is to file and activate a VFR flight plan over the radio, because I can't tell you how many times I've been out there flying and you didn't know you wanted a flight plan until you look out the window and you think, I would be totally screwed. I've only got a half a bottle of water. I didn't file a flight plan. I might eat my PLBs at home or whatever it is, and you look out the window, you need to be able to contact somebody on the radio. But to like what you said, give me Starlink and I'm fine with it, but that's not there yet. Where's that? Like, I mean, if that were here and they were saying, okay, this is better, fine, I can take better, but don't leave us with a big hole, So.
Right, exactly. And, and even beyond flight plans, like just calling and getting, the latest weather, getting, kind of an updated briefing, giving them a PIREP, getting a PIREP, those kinds of things too. Yeah. When you're VFR and for some of that stuff, I mean, you can call center, but sometimes they're busy, and there are definitely a few places where, flight service has radio coverage that center doesn't. And so, there's all these kinds of things. And I mean, and obviously the other one is even like pop-up IFRs. There's some places where you call ATC and they're like, call flight service and, file.
I know. Yeah, I do that all the time. Yeah, and I sometimes do that just so I don't have to feel like that guy. You know what I mean? I'll just take a minute and file it real quick so that I can at least call ATC without my tail between my legs and be like, I've got one on file,
Yeah.
But anyhow, Matt, I got to run. Thanks so much for being here today. Where can people find out information about 8flight?
Just go to 8flightapp.com. And we're doing more almost every day, so it's fun.
Awesome. Are you guys going to be at Oshkosh this year?
We will be at Oshkosh, Hangar C, wherever we were last year. I forget off the top of my head, but yeah. Yeah,
I'll find you in one of those. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for straightening me out on all that math. I appreciate it.
It's fun. Thanks, Jason.
All right. Yeah, you bet. Talk to you later. See ya. All right, aviators, that's fascinating stuff. So I think what the takeaway is there is somehow throughout my career, I took this no-go decision maker, if you don't have 70% of your takeoff speed by the halfway point, it's time to abort, and turned it into a go decision, right? It does not mean if you do have 70% of your takeoff speed by the halfway point, it does not necessarily mean you're going to make it. But it is true that if you do not have 70% of your takeoff speed by the halfway point, you're definitely going to crash the airplane and it's time to abort, and you still have enough runway in front of you to stop, which is what makes it a great rule of thumb. That is a subtle yet dramatic distinction. So make sure that if you're teaching this or using this, you're using it only as a way to show yourself that you will not make it. If it's a hypercritical takeoff and you really need to know for sure that you're going to make it off of a short runway, you should be doing what Catherine says, and that is using takeoff and landing performance charts to determine that. All right? Thank you guys so much for listening to this podcast. Please feel free to share it far and wide on YouTube. Leave a comment if you're watching this on YouTube. Please leave a review in whatever place you're listening to this. If you're not on YouTube, we really appreciate it. Consider joining us on Patreon every Friday. Those office hours they just kind of blow me away by how much really comes up. It's a great community of pilots. You can learn more at patreon.com/learntfp. I'm Jason Miller, and until I see you guys again, please be safe and fly your best.